I'm just going to talk today about some of the work that I've been doing over the last, 10, 15 so years around food banking. And so my talk today is entitled The Globalization of Food Banks in the World Regions. And you know, a lot of it is based off this book that I've been writing for a number of years that should be coming out at the end of 2023. And some of it is also just research that I'm doing around food banking in general. COVID initially kind of disrupted what I thought I was doing. And then, of course, it became the research in itself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions related around food banks and where COVID has sort of put them. So kind of three parts as I see it, about the globalization of food banking through a couple case studies in there. Of course, the book has a lot more case studies, but I'm just going to focus on a couple, then food banks in the COVID area, and then kind of end with some questions for us for the group. Here we go. So you all know the story around food banking. You know, but before I jump into the details about that, I probably should give you a little bit of background about myself. So, like many, I as a kid, I grew up in Cincinnati. That's where I'm at now, and volunteered at food banks, food pantries, and soup kitchens, and all the like. But it's not something that I really thought I was going to be studying per se. I went after my undergraduate degree, I was looking for work, and then there was an AmeriCorps project in Eastern Illinois, working for the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, and they were doing some GIS gap analysis, and that was sort of the first time I was introduced to a Feeding America a food bank. And so this was a food bank that sort of served a primarily rural, small town region. So we'd go to the small towns and learn a little bit about what was going on there. And that kind of propelled me to look at food banks in greater detail. And that's where the Chicago project that Josh was talking about came up, and looking at food banks there and really seeing, what is a behemoth, the kind of large scale warehouses that we're used to. I thought I was done with food banks after that, and then continuing my grad work out in California. And that's when I became more interested in the global aspect of food banking. And I actually was just looking at food access more generally in South Africa as part of my dissertation. Then all of a sudden, I bump into this new global food banking network that had been sort of evolving, splitting off from Feeding America into its own entity. And I didn't realize at the time how important the South African case study would be for food banking, for the understanding of food banking. And GFN staff will tell you how important they thought the South African case was. So there's that, and then the story continues. So, like many of us, probably, we had interest in food access, food insecurity, right to food, and this food banking thing just kind of has grown over these years, and so it continues to be something that kind of can't run away from. And so that's why, this project I kind of see as being really based on, about 15 years of research, mostly in-depth interviews of people who run food banks. But I've also spent a lot of time talking to people in government in different countries that work around food, and people in the corporate sector, in large food retailers, to your small informal food vendors and the like. So trying to get sort of a lay of the landscape. But we all know the story about food banking is now in maybe roughly 100 countries in our, it kind of depends how we count it. This map here continues to evolve. But when did the globalization of food banking start? Again, it kind of depends how we think about it. But one thing that I like to think about is, why is it spread so quickly? It's positions itself, as we all know, to gain stakeholders, across sectors, right? So folks in civil society for a variety of reasons, corporate sector, governments, everyone has something they like about it. And that's why there's been this sort of growth of it, because it's kind of fits this strategic lane, I would say. So in terms of the institutionalization, this is Chicago, Greater Chicago Food Depository. Food banking probably is institutionalized, we could argue, in much of North America, Europe. Is it the case that that's what's happening in other parts of the world? And I think that's something that we want to kind of think through. as I've been studying Feeding America in the US, it's gone up the charity rankings. Now I think it's actually the #1 charity in the United States. At least that's what happened during the COVID years. So we know all this, but just kind of reminding us about how big it is, the geography of it, where are these food banks? This is something that also keeps changing. The GFN just redid their website and they've added more countries to their list of places that they're working in. And you'll see what's interesting is while food banks, are probably most associated with the core, so to speak, of where they started in North America and Europe, a lot of these global food bank governance entities like GFN are really interested in spreading food banks around the world. And so the new frontiers, so to speak, are in Africa and Asia, but you can see that there already is a presence there, in some, either if it's in GFN or through the other alliances. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today are the 3 big alliances. There's the Global Food Banking Network that we all know is probably spend our most time on, connected with Feeding America, based out of Chicago. FBRN, which is the Food Banking Regional Network, that's located out of Dubai, origins in Egypt. That really has a presence in Asia and Africa. And then FEBA, of course, which is the European Federation of Food Banks, which is in Europe. So there's a global aspect to this. The first network, GFN, like I said, this map constantly is needing to be updated. And so the GFN is very actively moving. They've already been in Latin America for many years, in South America. They are trying to really push into parts of Asia and into sub-Saharan Africa. And so the number of countries keeps expanding. Interestingly, they operate, and there's many different sort of what I would call socio-political contexts. Some of the countries have strong welfare states, others do not. But I think that they still look for a certain prototype when they're trying to develop their food banks. And that's why the South African case was so important. They, again, often talk about that case because of some of the pre-existing aspects of the society that they thought would be helpful for food bank to work well. Also, in contrast to other networks, the GFN really spends a lot of time training and certifying food banks. Josh is going to the Leadership Institute in a couple weeks. This is something that is very central to the mission of what they do at GFN. They keep updating their graphics, but they really have this piece where they're trying to monitor their food banks. They have these different levels of certification. We all know about the global, the policy atlas, where they're trying to analyze donation laws and regulations to make sure that those environments fit food banking. So the GFN has really sort of positioned itself also with sustainable development goals. So it wants to be at the forefront of issues around food insecurity, food waste, whatever the kind of challenges of the day are, they just evolve. So now it's climate change, it was the Ukraine-Russia war, it's inflation, it's COVID. They just continue to evolve and to sort of make sure that they're on the center stage. European Food Banks Federation, headquarters in Brussels. Its origins were in Paris. It only went there recently. They've been very focused right now on the Ukraine situation. They're a little bit different, I think, from the GFN, and that the GFN, again, spends more time. Expansion is always their thing. They're talking about new markets. They're talking about certification, training, things like that. What I've kind of noticed more is that while this network is held together, first of all, the move from Paris to Brussels is notable because, obviously with this being close to the center of power for the EU was part of that. But also, the continent is very different in terms of social welfare development, social welfare state development, poverty levels, the relationship between state and NGOs, right? Those are very different across the continent. And so the FEBA, at least when I've spoken to people, they're very interested in trying to do what they can for members, but it's, I would say, maybe a little bit less top down than the GFN is in that sense, or a little bit less focused on monitoring their food banks. But they do facilitate corporate relationships pretty significantly, have a pretty big network. So FIBA, GFN. Third one I wanted to mention that often gets left out is the Food Banking Regional Network. This is in Dubai. Now, what's important to note here is that while the FBRN initially started in Egypt, it's headquartered in Dubai. It's, basically folks that were in the hotel tourism industry saw waste there. There's a lot of wealth in the Gulf states in terms of that they saw in the hotel industry, and they kind of evolved from the feeling like the folks that were relatively wealthy in that industry wanted to do something to redistribute the food. But what's important is you're talking about contexts that are often autocratic, don't have a well-developed social safety net. And more importantly, I would say, for the sake of this conversation, really have limited monitoring of the food banks. And so, on their website, and even when you talk to people who, run FBRN, they'll say that they have, food banks in all these different countries on the map here, maybe up to 39 or 40. But it's not really clear what's going on in a lot of these countries. Is the food bank maybe started and then haven't really visited since? And so much more of a sort of laissez-faire kind of approach, I guess, towards the food bank management. And they're not really monitoring their food banks as much as like GFN is. So that's important because it looks like there's a lot of coverage, so to speak, in development of food banks in a lot of South Asia, in Southwestern Asia, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not necessarily clear that that's completely the case. And so it's based off of these different pillars. So those are the three broad kind of governance networks that I see. I wanted to kind of give you a little bit more detail about some of the things that I was mentioning earlier. One of the interesting case studies is in South Africa. Again, the book that I wrote has a lot more. I'm just giving you some highlights here. Funny enough, Food Forward South Africa used to be called Food Bank South Africa, but they thought that it was too close to. There were some folks in the banking industry that didn't like that had the word bank in it. So I thought that was funny. It's been around, for about 15 years or so. Like I said, when I was doing my PhD research, it's expanded into most of the major cities and rural areas. But again, what's really important to note is that the GFN views Food Forward South Africa as its really, in their view, successful pilot project. And so they often say that they learned a lot of lessons that they apply in other contexts, or that they will apply in other contexts that they learned from this case. And so what did they like about the country to start with? They liked that it had a great, need, so to speak, with food insecurity. They liked that it had, in their view, a stable political system, a very well-developed, formalized food system for food retailers. So they liked that. And that was part of what drew them to South Africa, the GFN. But, what's funny is I can tell you that, like, when I've spoken to government administrators in South Africa, and they're literally about to come out and talk publicly about how great the food bank is, as an offside comment, they'll tell me stuff like, this food bank project, it's just a way to, help. It's like just for corporations, just, they're going to throw out food, and it's basically just like a corporate welfare thing or whatever, or how they phrase it. And so it's just kind of funny that they're kind of, doing like a double speak about in public, right, using the food bank as an opportunity to talk about what they are doing, right, to own that. But then at the same time, in reality, they don't actually think it's doing a lot. And so, like I said, food banks in most of the major cities. One of the questions for Food Forward South Africa, if it's going to be this great pilot project, it has had major ups and downs, really big financial and capacity issues. There's been moments where it's about closed, and people who've run it have told me that. They've overextended themselves. They had government support initially, then government They have no government support anymore. They found that to be a very bad working relationship. So now they basically are just fundraising, in the private sector and with individuals. I visited projects like the one here on the bottom in rural KwaZulu-Natal, this rural food bank project, and they spent all this money and nothing is to come of it, right? And so there's been a lot of starts and stops with the project. They run into friction with existing food charities that are doing work like this. And so there's been a lot of challenges. Food Bank Johannesburg, I have a picture here. You know what? They've moved to like 5 different locations in a 12-year period or something. So there's a lot of questions about what difference is this organization really making in the community? In whose interest did it develop? Is it just, initially it was just a project for government to kind of tout? Is it really actually only helping the corporate sector? So they've had the people who've run Food Forward to South Africa have kind of had to figure out, what are they doing? What do they do well? What will be the future of what they are? How do they distinguish themselves as a charity? And so there's a lot of kind of unanswered questions there. A second case study I think that's very interesting is in India Food Banking Network, another country that has high poverty and inequality rates, but a much smaller social safety net. South Africa has one of the arguably largest social grant systems in the world for comparative countries in the global South. India it does not have that same social welfare program. It has some programs, but not that one. It's been this food banking network. Actually, if you look on the GFN website, you'll notice that they have multiple food banking related organization NGOs that are in India. And so that's because, again, if you talk to GFN staff, they'll tell you they've had a lot of trouble in India making their presence known. And part of it is that the GFN have, at least some of the staff have admitted that they came in and they had ideas about how the food system was organized, and it didn't really match reality. So in India, how is it different? India is a very large country, much bigger, let's say, than South Africa. It has much more rural poverty. There's much greater distances between cities. The way people access food, there's a lot more fresh food that's accessed on a daily basis, so they might not have as much food waste in the way that GFN understands it. Like I said, there's multiple charities operating in the space, and the government really never came on board from the start. Government just kind of viewed this food banking network as, just another charity operating. And the government would also say things like, that's great, you're feeding 50,000 kids through your school feeding program, but we're looking to be, we have 1 billion people in the country, so you're good for you, but you're small, and they weren't really able to garner the same support. Where in South Africa, from the start, the GFN folks went to high-level people in the South African government to make those relationships. And yet in South Africa, like I said, it's still kind of struggled in many ways. And so India has its own struggles that have been very different. And while you might look at the map here and say, okay, they have food banks in all these different cities, what's the presence there? How significant is it? What can it really be long term? So just a couple examples, South Africa and India, but you can see that, where South Africa might be viewed as the pilot, for GFN, India really was like the holy grail. It's like the country they really wanted to make a big impact because it has, historically been known for very high food insecurity rates, and they thought they can make a major, major difference. And they've really struggled in those two contexts. So that kind of, makes us think, what's the potential for the food bank in other countries in the global South, in South Asia, in Africa, where food insecurity rates are the highest? Is the food banking model, as GFN understands it, really going to work in those contexts? One thing I haven't mentioned also is logistical challenge. India, it could take many hours to get from point A to point B. Food banking is really arguably more of an urban distribution system than it is rural. So there's a lot of reasons that we can be concerned about it. But that's quick. I don't want to, talk for 2 hours, so I want to move on to some other stuff. I want to talk a little bit about food banks in the COVID era. While I was working on this book, COVID happened, and I'm like, great, now what do I do? It's kind of messed up all the research I'm doing, when of course it became a really important moment to understand some of these questions. And I think we really have to think through, where were food banks before COVID? Where were they during? And I don't know if we're after COVID, but where are they going? Are food banks in a stronger position, a weaker position, because of COVID? And so a few things just to note here. We already know this: during COVID, food insecurity rates doubled, really uneven impacts. So we had disruptions such as increases in food prices, limited food access, changes in production, disruptions in supply chains. One thing that's really interesting is that we had really large government stimulus programs in many parts of the world, particularly in the global north. And what happened as a result of that, at least the studies that I've seen, is that poverty rates were not as high, food insecurity rates rather, as high as expected, arguably because of those large investments. And I think that really is important, because it showed the importance of when government makes really strong commitment to income and food support programs. And so we have to kind of think about that, and think about, while food banks, of course, got a lot of visibility initially, right? They really struggled. They closed. They weren't really capable of, doing what they said they were going to do. Also related to food waste, right? We know this, a lot of wasted food, and there were some government programs in certain contexts to reduce food waste, but it was really more ad hoc. You read stories about, somebody saving food for this purpose or that purpose, but it wasn't systematic. And so the big picture here is that the COVID crisis, I think, really, it revealed a lot of our contradictions and our problems in the food system at large. And everything was kind of laid bare there. What I spent some time doing during COVID is speaking with people who ran food banks in Europe. I had spoken to some in person before COVID. During COVID, I would had to be more remote conversations. Not surprisingly, we know, right, that food aid demand was high across the continent. In the first few months of 2020, we know that food banks were not meeting the need. Some of the data, by the way, that I'm giving you is data that is that I collected, but some of it actually is FEBA. If you go on FEBA's website, they did about 4, maybe even 5 surveys of their own food bank systems to see how they were dealing with COVID. And then a lot of the food banks systems themselves in different countries have their own surveys. So they weren't meeting the need. The demand was really high. What were they not meeting, or what did food banks have that they needed but they didn't have? Obviously, in some contexts they didn't have food, but they also didn't have the personnel, and that's one of the big reasons that they closed. We know about a lot of the volunteers were older, susceptible to COVID in a significant way. They didn't have the protective devices. They didn't have money. But this was only in the first few months. And so what we could say initially in COVID, the impacts were increases in demand, higher operational costs. So you're having to maybe figure out how you're going to distribute food, in a non-touch way. You have to deliver it with trucks. Well, you don't have enough trucks, so you don't have enough boxes, you don't have personnel. You might have had reduced food stocks, disruptions in food donations. We all know about, that there was really messed up things about, right, people were runs on food, but then there were also in stores shelves were empty, but at the same time there wasn't, there was waste. Decreases in volunteers and personnel. As I said, a lot of it is because the 65 and older group. let's see here. I already mentioned the lack of equipment for frontline folks, and the closure, right? So this all led to the closure of food banks, and their beneficiaries for many months in 2020. Okay, to give you a couple examples here, in the Netherlands, what's interesting, and again, about the Europe context, particularly some of the examples I'm going to mention, is that, supposedly these are countries, at least in the general sense, that have a very well-developed social safety net. So why would they need food banks? What we're seeing, of course, over the last couple of decades is that food banks in Europe have grown in a pretty dramatic way. And many countries have very large food bank systems. Obviously in the UK, in Germany, in Italy, and in Spain and elsewhere. So there is a food bank system that developed in the Netherlands. Really, if you talk to people who run the food bank, there's much more of an acknowledgement and compared to, like, let's say in the US, where the food bank system only would be complementary because the social welfare state is a much more something that people are a little bit more openly committed to than they might be in the US, or you might hear some more anti-welfare state sort of rhetoric. With that being said, there have been some changes in terms of scaling back some aspects of this welfare state, but the food bank there was really about reducing corporate food waste. There were challenges before COVID around, stigma with clients and nutrition, right? Some things we already know about. But the big thing that I would circle with the Dutch food bank system, when I visited there before COVID, they were very proud of their voluntary workforce. Nobody there got paid at all, and that's what they would always tell me. So not surprisingly, during COVID, we know that the network was overstretched. There's a lot of closure. Really, again, revealed some key weaknesses in the model around how the food bank was operating. And these days, really, I would argue, the food bank system there is still trying to regain its footing. So are they better off, worse off? Not so sure yet, right? A little bit too early to tell. And that really contrasts with what I experienced when I spoke with folks in Norway. Yeah, there are food banks in Scandinavia. Norway, obviously Sweden, Denmark, Finland, countries that are known for having, some of the strongest social welfare states in the world, very low poverty rates. But even there, food bank systems have developed, and they were in Norway, very small before COVID. And what's interesting is what happened during COVID, unlike in some other places. And the woman I actually spoke to who's one of the key kind of administrators in Food Bank Norway, very proud of the fact that they're in a much stronger position now after COVID. She wrote about it in an academic journal that just came out, I think, this year, about some of the innovations that they were able to make in the food bank system in Norway. Why were they able to make this? Well, they were unknown before COVID, as she said. And then during COVID, things that were, I kind of struck me as kind of, I don't know, absurd in a way, but kind of interesting. She said that, the King of Norway told her, I never knew why we had food banks in Norway. And now I see, that they're really critical to society, right? And it's a literal quote that she said when she, was talking to the king. And so the visibility was greater, which of course led to greater fundraising. And so the food bank in Norway, they were able to increase their size because they had more money to do some of the things that they wanted to do. So in different corners of Europe, we're seeing different stories emerge. Every country, of course, has its own story. But food banks are arguably going to develop, or are developing, across the continent. They might be much smaller in a place like Norway than they might be, let's say, in Southern Europe. But they do seem to be that they're going to be kind of with us, which is interesting. And if you look on FIBA's website, Norway is part of FIBA. I don't think Sweden is yet. So this is something that is kind of continuing to evolve. Oh, one other thing that's interesting I've noticed is that in Northern Europe, there's a lot more talk about food waste, the environmental aspects. Like in Denmark, they came up a lot. In the South, a lot more talk around food banks and the relationship with poverty, which actually became a double-edged sword, because in Italy and in Spain, where the food bank systems are very large, while the food banks positioned themselves in their mission around anti-poverty efforts, that's what they said they did. There was a lot of hostility as well in various in aspects of society where people would say, you know, food banks are not really going to be a sufficient way to decrease poverty. So interestingly, these things kind of play out differently across the continent. All right, my last case study here is in Greece. Greece is a place where, you know, higher poverty rate, kind of crisis after crisis, it seems, over the last 20 years. And so you see that with the unemployment rate higher, the social welfare state a little bit less developed. Interestingly, in some ways, Greece fits more of the Southern European profile, and also in other ways fits more of the Eastern European profile. And the reason I say that is because a lot of countries that I spoke to in Eastern Europe, and this is before the Ukraine war, spoke about anti-NGO hostility from government, and that the governments were openly hostile to the development of food banks because they viewed them as Western. They viewed them as shining a negative light on the government. And so Greece, that was very much the case. And so what was constantly communicated to me by people who work in the food banks in Greece is that this hostility around food banks and NGOs kind of got accelerated in COVID. Food banks really weren't seen as something that's helping confront COVID. The food bank in Greece really had significant ups and downs with the kind of food that they got. And so honestly, the situation in Greece, they'll tell you, is that the food bank there is probably much worse off after COVID than it was beforehand. And one thing that's been, I don't want to say positive, but from a researcher standpoint, one thing that's been helpful to understand what's gone on in a lot of different countries, Greece is this would be in this case, and name with Norway and other places as well. Greece made this really well-developed survey analysis of their system that they have there around food banks, and trying to understand how COVID impacted their operations, and that's the same thing Norway did. And so we're kind of able to see how these different things are playing out across the continent. And so, you know, if I were to kind of connect some of these case studies, if it's Greece, if it's Norway, Netherlands, South Africa, and India, right? Very different context. But what do we see? We see places that the context of how the food system is organized, how society is organized, how state civil society is organized, really is a major factor, the most important factor, determining if food banks will develop successfully or not, in my opinion. And so, you know, that's something that I'm not sure to what extent, you know, the GFN is really aware of that or wants to acknowledge that. So if I were to kind of wrap up some big thoughts here for us, you know, a lot of what I've seen, particularly in COVID, right, is that COVID reminded us that the fragility of the charity-based food system, that we already know that it's a vulnerable patchwork, not really designed to overcome food insecurity in the way which some people sometimes there's a slippage, right, where food insecurity is viewed as you know, that they think they can repurpose food waste to reduce food insecurity, right? That these are two different issues. I think number three, really important here, COVID reminded us the power of government. You know, the government initiatives have the capacity, when the will is there, the political will, to make a big difference. And so countries where stimulus was not initiated, stimulus packages, we're seeing, you know, probably the impact of COVID, I think, last much longer. I think we're going to see, you know, significant increase in poverty rates for a much longer time. Also, things we already know, right? The limits of a volunteer-based philanthropy system. You know, is this story about food banks, or is this a story about charity? You know, and the limits of charity more generally, something for us to think about. And I think we really want to think about where food banks are situated in a post-COVID world, because I think COVID really was a key moment. When I've analyzed the budgets of all these food banks in the US or in, you know, in different parts of the world, the story seems to be the same, in that we have this really bloated budget. because of fundraising during COVID. The question was, will the fundraising continue to be as great? Often not the case. But at the same time, some of these food banks are never going to be what they were before COVID. And I think that's something we have to kind of think about. Some of this kind of feeds into, critiques we already know here as a group, the depoliticization of hunger, reduction of welfare state protection, new bureaucracies, food banks over-relying on the food industry, very much defining things as, technical problems to be fixed within the market, and that they have small impacts, right? These are things that we already know. But so here's some questions for us that we may not have answers to, and I want us to think about. Central to this conversation, I think, often is, well, what impact do food banks make? And so it often comes back to, because this is the reality of the world we live in, emphasis on data. There are always these questions around how much do food banks reduce food insecurity and food waste? And the limited information we have is that they don't make a big difference, a very small difference. But I still think, the more information we can get out there and understand, the better. In part because we need to counter these narratives where it's about how many pounds, kilograms, meals served, those metrics that the food banks put out, we know are kind of distracting to what really should be. They don't really actually have to do with the mission, because the mission is the mission to reduce food insecurity. Well, are you really doing that? And that's actually honestly hard to measure because there's so many intervening variables. But I think as a group, we know that the impact is probably very small. So what's the ideal role of a food bank within a broader food governance policy? The reason I ask that is because, I don't realistically think food banks are going away. Feeding America, for example, is enormous. It's not going to shut its doors. However, maybe we have an opportunity to reformulate and to reposition and to refocus what their mission should be. And so not only when we're speaking to people who may or may not be receptive in the food banking world, but also in government, in different circles, and advocating what's our vision going to be. I think just to say let's close down food banks is not going to, I think it's going to not, people are going to shut us out if we just say that. I think it's better to sort of emphasize, more of a reformulation. And I think that's hard. 3, okay, what is the potential food bank success in the global South? This is important because, I looked at South Africa, India, there's other examples. GFN, for example, continues to push out into the global South. They're already very much in South America, but Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, where they view, the sort of holy grail, right? The places with the highest food insecurity rates. Are these really the right initiatives for those contexts? The GFN thinks it is. And so I think we have to be really focused on that. I'd mentioned the food banks often ran into friction with the existing food systems. One thing that, we're talking around here is that in the global South, the informal food sector is dominant. And so how do food banks fit within that? Well, they view it often as kind of an enemy, as something that is antithetical to what they're doing. They view it as a place where black market food is sold, and not as a place that really can be partnering with or is part of, or is the key part of the food system. Number 5 here about how it's connected to food banks to the rest of the world. How much are these food bank stories local stories and how much are these global stories? It's not the case that GFN just goes into a place, picks a place out of nowhere. Oftentimes there's already something that is in existence. And then there's a conversation that happens between the GFN folks and people in a particular local context. And that's even just talking about at the national level, right? We can think about it much more localized than that. So it's more complicated than that. And I think those dynamics are something that we want to really pay attention to. Right. And we know number 6, it's not going to be overcoming food insecurity. So things to think about moving forward. And I know this group has been focusing on that. We need to reframe the discussion and refocus people that food waste is a different issue, different set of issues from food insecurity, and food banks are not going to solve both problems by repurposing food waste, right, and reducing food insecurity. They keep positioning themselves discursively as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is how they keep pushing it, but also just, more generally. So if Feeding America, for example, is gonna be here, and many food banks are gonna be here, what's their role to be? Is their role going to be a niche role, targeted role? What should it be? Can food banks play a very targeted role in small contexts? Or do we, think that they should play no role? I think number two is critical, because it's easy to be critical of what we see, but then the next question is, well, what do you think it should be? And so that's something that the alternative vision, I think, is the hard part. And it's going to maybe be different in different contexts, probably will be. I'd already talked about, we have to push for support for food and income programs, right to food. I know this group is very supportive of that. Pushing companies to pay living wages, getting out of, and this is a hard one, limiting their influence on food bank operations. Is that even possible? They're on the board of many of these food banks. Food banks are beholden to many corporates, and so they're limited in terms of their scope of advocacy, right? This kind of, box they put themselves in. Others in the group here have talked about how we need to think about integrating the knowledge and experiences of folks that are food insecure into food bank operations. This was not as obvious as it should have been in the South African case. So that's why if you talk to folks in the GFN about what happened in South Africa and India, part of the reason they ran into trouble is because they just had a vision of how Feeding America works. And they said, oh, well, we can do that in South Africa and India. Obviously, that makes no sense. But this whole question about local knowledge and how it's fitting in or not fitting into some of these broader conversations. And that's why I'd be interested when Josh reports back on the Leadership Institute. So really, food banks, can they play a niche role? Open-ended question. But what we do know is that they really don't work well in rural areas, right? Which in many parts of the world is a significant component of food insecurity, very different in what it is. They don't necessarily work in tandem with informal economies, which is very much part of how the Global South's food system is organized. And so food banks, I think the GFN is really trying to push through some of these challenges and some of these issues in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And I'm really can tell you if that's a place that I want to continue focusing on. So a lot of what I talked about is in this upcoming book with University of Iowa Press that should hopefully be out at the end of the year. But I'm finding myself continuing to want to know more. And so my next project is going to be looking at food bank development, tracing it, tracking it in sub-Saharan Africa. That map that they have is expanding: Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Botswana, Mozambique, Madagascar, others. And so it's just, what is the end? What is the purpose here? And so this is something that, I really want to spend some time on, because I think we really need to have some more of a local understanding of that. So anyways, that's it for me. Thanks for listening. Open to any questions anyone has. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's really helpful seeing it laid out like this. And I just want to open the floor to anybody who has questions, comments for Dan.
Hi, Dan. I have a question, sort of. Thank you. That was really interesting. Just so much that I didn't know. And I look forward to looking at the recording again to just process it all. But you made me think about India's kind of existing right to food programs, some of which have been being eroded. Part of the reason that the farmers' protest was happening. So they've had big projects around managing surpluses, for example. And and I think a lot of those work in rural contexts. I don't know a huge amount about it, but I was wondering if you'd thought at all about the link between some of those existing kind of right to food programs that have been managed at a state level, and then food banking, and what doesn't work in the rural context there. For instance, is it to do with like the lack of supermarketization there? There's like a different, that food banking thrives on a certain kind of centralization that's not privatized. That's sorry, not a very clear question, but that was the thought that popped up. Thank you.
No, thanks for the question. I mean, India is a really interesting case, and you're right. I think to think about these issues, we have to think about the broader socio-political context. And so you're right, the farmers protest relates to bigger questions around how food is produced, livelihoods for folks, how people how the economy is structured in India, what kind of support the government has, what they envision for what the country is going to be. Because in many ways, what was that about? I mean, you could say it's about the neoliberalization of of agriculture in India, to make the country, as they put it, more competitive. And that vision. So in some ways, honestly, the food banking model is really, it's small potatoes, in India. It's not really something that's on the main, the government doesn't view it with a lot of seriousness right now. And I think you're right. I think that food banks, are really arguably designed for large cities where we have these large food retailers that produce a lot of food waste. And so really what we're talking about is food banks really work in places where there's the greatest inequality, where there's the greatest, that's another contradiction of the system, places of capitalist accumulation, or however you want to put it. I think it's kind of running up into a wall in India, and even the great large cities of the country, logistically moving something from A to B is very difficult. Traffic, and just kind of infrastructure. These cities are designed very differently. And so I think that's another reason why, the food bank system there really hasn't really come to be much. But at the same time, the one I looked at is just one of, I think, a few. If you look on the GFN website, like I said, they've got a few different food charities that they've identified. They're really keen on expanding themselves in India. And again, I think it's part of the GFN's broader vision that they want to be on the table, as a key player around in the sustainable development goals in that space around, food waste, food poverty reduction, climate change, all the big issues. And I'll be curious, Josh, when you go, if you see, a lot of that being talked about and pushed. Because what's interesting with the Leadership Institute is it has folks from all over the world. So to what extent will those be, the same kind of, how much of it will be a top-down kind of, this is what we envision for you to become a certified member of our group, as opposed, you know what I mean? Which is a different way of talking about it.
You kind of talked about the emphasis on food waste in Europe. Was that extending in other cases, across the globe, or were those more focused on food insecurity?
No, thanks for that question. I think that what food banks have in many contexts is they evolve, they're flexible with their mission, maybe is the way to put it. And they're just speaking to whatever their stakeholders or their donors think is important. And so in many parts of Northern Europe, for example, environmental concerns are very paramount. And so they can find more opportunity to talk about food waste as an issue, or, questions around poverty are politically charged. And so, when I was in Australia, people said that they started talking more about food waste because people would go on these tangents when it came to, food insecurity, about how people didn't deserve food, and that whole sort of line of conversation, where food waste, they were able to kind of broaden their sort of appeal. So I think it really depends on the place. Like in South Africa, it's much more of a focus on poverty reduction, just because that's so paramount. That's such a prominent sort of aspect of when you read the sort of unemployment rate and the inequality that exists there. So I think you're onto something really interesting, because it's like a flexible, and I don't know to what extent that is something that folks in these various places have determined themselves, or if the GFN has kind of given talking points, but
Martin, you have a question?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much, Dan. This was very interesting. I believe this is a very valuable information, especially for organizations like international organizations working in the food sovereignty field, working also right to food, on food security issues on a global level. So my first question is actually if you have also like a what to say, a more popular version of your future book, so that can be accessible and readable for this kind of organization. My other question is how did you, like, what is your perception when you, for example, studied these cases in Greece or in South Africa, in India? What is the kind of reading that social movements there have of these initiatives? What is their perception, also their status of information, and what is going on? Especially South Africa would be very interesting to know.
Yeah, no, thanks for the questions. Yeah. The book will be coming out at the end of the year and hopefully present some of the information, you know, a little bit more in a clearer way and more detailed. There's more different case studies there, so I can keep in touch with you about that in the coming months. But you bring up a great set of points around social movements. You know, it's interesting, every context is different. So South Africa, I found that, you know, there wasn't as much talk around food, but it might be something where it would be repositioned around, you know, pro-poor, right? It'd be about poverty, or it'd be around something that's different. And so sometimes in certain contexts, you know, and this is a question again for the group at large, is like, sometimes I'm always wondering, you know, are we talking about food, or are we actually talking about something else? You know, are we talking about poverty? You know, to what extent is food insecurity different from poverty or food access or whatever it might be? And so in the broader sort of, you know, the world outside food banks, like you said, when it comes to social movements, my sense and what I saw in South Africa was that people weren't as hostile to food banks, in part because they didn't know as much about them. The people who might be more hostile to them were people who were in the charity world, who were not so sure about like what they were doing, or that they are, you know, they really making a difference. But in terms of like broader social movements, it was much more about like, let's put pressure on government, you know, around the way that social grants are organized, or, you know, employment opportunities. And so it wasn't, if that makes sense, really always about food. And so you'll find, I think, a different kind of example in every context. But that was my experience there. Yeah. And that's why we need experts on every country. You know, some of these countries I've spent more time on than others. And so some of them I know a little bit more on than others. But a lot of this is really a story of, you know, of each society. You know, the food bank works well or it doesn't work well because of the structure of the food system, because of state civil society relations in those particular places.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. I feel like we could go on, and it's particularly the implications for, you know, what this group is trying to do in building a counter narrative. But we have about 20 minutes left to get through some of the important GSA business. So yeah, feel free to reach out to Dan for further questions. And we look forward to your book. I know it's a heavy lift.
Yeah, it will come out eventually, or so they tell me. So thanks.
Yeah.